The morning Martha Rourke discovered the discrepancy in the ranch ledger. The sun had barely crested the Oklahoma Territory hills, and the coffee in her tin cup had gone cold without her noticing. She had come to the Fairchild Ranch in the late spring of 1882 with little more than a carpetbag, a pair of cracked leather-work gloves, and a determination so fierce it could have bent iron. The advertisement had been pinned to the board outside the general store in Dusty Creek, written in careful block letters on a square of brown paper: ranch hand wanted, honest work, fair wages. Inquire at the Fairchild property, 12 miles north of town. Raymond Fairchild, proprietor. Martha had read it twice, folded it into the breast pocket of her coat, and walked straight to the livery stable to ask about borrowing a horse. She was 26 years old, lean and capable. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned firmly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to her late father. Her hands were already calloused from 3 years of working a neighbor's farm after the bank had taken her family's land in Missouri. She had come west looking for work that paid decently, and a situation that would not require her to smile prettily and pour tea. She had found plenty of places willing to hire a woman for domestic work. She wanted none of it. She wanted the land, the horses, the physical labor that made her feel solid and real in a world that kept trying to tell her she was not equipped for such things. When she arrived at the Fairchild Ranch that Tuesday afternoon, the place was both more and less than she had expected. The main house was substantial, built from good timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides, but the fences along the east pasture were sagging badly, and 3 of the outbuildings clearly needed new roofing. 2 horses stood in a paddock looking somewhat neglected, and the kitchen garden along the south side of the house had gone almost entirely to weeds. A man came out of the barn before she had fully dismounted, wiping his hands on a rag that was doing very little to clean them. He was perhaps 32 or 33, tall with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his shirt, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of good whiskey held up to the light. He looked tired in the way that people look when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have simply gotten used to the weight. He stopped when he saw her. Then he looked past her, as though expecting someone else to appear from behind the scrub oak at the edge of the drive. "Mr. Fairchild," Martha said, keeping her voice even and businesslike. "That's right." He took another step closer. "Can I help you, Miss?" "Mrs. Rourke," she said, not because she wanted to invoke the marriage that had lasted only 14 months before Daniel Rourke had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, but because she had found that the title of Mrs. rather than Miss created a particular shift in men's expressions, something that moved from dismissiveness toward a slightly more cautious form of respect. "Martha Rourke, I am here about the position." Raymond Fairchild blinked at her. "The ranch hand position. That is the one posted in town, yes." He looked at her again, not unkindly but thoroughly. "Mrs. Rourke, the work here is considerable. Fence mending, horse management, morning and evening feeds, some driving of the wagon for supply runs, general repair work. It's not— I know what ranch work is," she said pleasantly. "I have been doing it for 3 years. Before that I worked my family's farm in Missouri from the time I was old enough to carry a bucket. I can ride, I can rope, I can mend fence and shoe a horse in under an hour if the animal cooperates. I am available to start immediately, and I do not require quarters if that complicates matters, though I would prefer them if they are available. I have good references from Mr. and Mrs. Henry Callum of Larimer County if you require them." Raymond Fairchild stood very still for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was close to one. "The bunkhouse has a separate room at the far end," he said. "Been using it for storage, but it can be cleared." "I can clear it myself," Martha said. "What is the wage?" $8 a month, he said. "Same as I offered the last man who applied." Martha held out her hand and Raymond Fairchild shook it, and that was how it began. The first week was largely about proving herself, which she had expected and was not troubled by. Raymond Fairchild watched her from a careful distance as she assessed the fences and made a systematic list of what materials were needed. He watched her work with the horses, a gray mare named Duchess and a young bay gelding who was still being gentled, and he watched the way she moved around them, quiet and steady. He did not interfere, and he did not offer unnecessary instruction, which raised him considerably in her estimation. By the end of the first week, the east pasture fence was repaired, the bunkhouse room had been cleared and made livable, and Martha had also, without being asked, reorganized the tack room in the barn, because the disorganization of it had been causing her a quiet physical distress every time she passed through it. Raymond Fairchild had come in while she was finishing and stood in the doorway looking at the neatly hung bridles and the coiled ropes and the sorted bottles of liniment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It needed doing," she replied simply. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. "My foreman left 8 months ago," he said, as though he owed her some explanation. "Took 2 of the hands with him when he went. I have been managing since then with whoever I can get for short stints, but nobody has stayed." "Why did he leave?" Martha asked. She was not one for dancing around questions. Raymond was quiet again. "His brother had land in New Mexico. He wanted to go." A pause. "I have not been the easiest man to work for since my wife passed 2 years back. I am aware of that." Martha looked at him steadily. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it without any performance attached to it. She understood loss in that clean, factual way that people do when they have weathered it and come out the other side still standing. Raymond nodded once and left the barn, and Martha went back to hanging the last of the bridles. The days settled into a rhythm that Martha found deeply satisfying. She rose before dawn, fed and watered the horses, checked the fence lines on a rotating schedule that she had worked out herself, handled whatever repair work the day required, and spent the late afternoons doing the heavier work while the light was still good. Raymond worked alongside her more often than she had expected, and she found that he was not a man who stood around directing while others labored. He dug post holes and swung hammers and drove nails with the same focused attention he gave to everything else. They did not talk excessively, but the talking they did was good. One morning in the second week, while they were mending the section of fence along the north pasture, he asked her how she had come from Missouri to Oklahoma Territory. She told him plainly. The bank taking the farm, the move to Colorado to work for the Callums, the death of her husband before that, the gradual westward drift of someone who found that movement helped when things were difficult. She did not dress it up or make it sad. It was simply what had happened. Raymond listened without interrupting, which she found unusual and good. "You've had a hard run of it," he said when she had finished. "I have had a life," she said. "Most of it has been all right." He was quiet for a moment, driving a nail cleanly into the post. "My wife's name was Clara," he said, and then he seemed to surprise himself by saying it as though he had not planned to and was not sure why he had. Martha waited. "She was sick for almost a year before she died," he said. "The ranch went to pieces a bit during that time because I was more concerned with her than with anything else. Afterward I tried to pull it back together, but he stopped, drove another nail. It's been a process." "You're pulling it back," Martha said. He glanced at her sideways. "We are pulling it back," he said, and something about the way he said "we," so quietly and naturally, settled in Martha's chest like a warm thing. The third week, a man named Cord Whitley rode up from Dusty Creek to inquire about the ranch hand position he had heard was available. He was large and sunburned and looked at Martha with the kind of open disbelief that she had encountered many times in her life. He spoke to Raymond as though Martha were not standing 3 feet away. "You got a woman doing the work," Cord said. "I have a ranch hand doing the work," Raymond said, his voice entirely neutral, "and the position is filled." Cord Whitley rode back to town looking somewhat affronted, and Martha continued mending the hinge on the barn door she had been working on, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over her. What she did not know then, what she would not discover until a morning in late September, was the matter of the ledger. Raymond Fairchild kept his accounts in a stiff leather-bound book that lived on the desk in the small room off the kitchen he used as an office. Martha had no particular reason to go into that room, and no particular curiosity about it. She kept to her work and her quarters and the barn and the pastures, and Raymond Fairchild kept to the house and the herd management and the business end of things. But on a Wednesday morning in late September, Raymond had ridden out to the far south pasture to check on a heifer that had been looking poorly the previous evening, and he had left the office door open and asked Martha, almost in passing, if she would look for the supply receipt from the hardware store in Dusty Creek, because he thought he might have placed it on the desk, and he needed the figure for a letter he was writing. Martha went into the office and found the receipt quickly enough, sitting in plain sight near the edge of the desk. She was about to leave when she noticed the ledger was open, the pages covered in Raymond's deliberate handwriting, columns of figures and dates and notations. She would not have thought anything of it except that her own name caught her eye, and she stopped. Martha Rourke, wages. And beside it, on two separate monthly entries now, figures that made her go very still. The agreed wage was $8 a month. She had received $8 at the end of her first month, in coin, counted out cleanly. She had received $8 at the end of her second month. But the ledger showed $16 per month, twice the agreed amount, both entries. Martha stood there for a moment looking at the numbers. She read them again carefully to make certain she was not misreading the cramped figures. She was not. She set down the receipt, which she had forgotten she was holding, and she stood in the middle of Raymond Fairchild's office looking at his ledger with a feeling she could not quite name building steadily in her chest. She was not a woman who let things sit. She had never learned the patience for letting problems or questions or unresolved things simply hover in the air. She picked the receipt back up, set it where she could find it later, closed the ledger carefully, and went back to her work in the barn. She waited until Raymond rode back that afternoon. She watched him unsaddle the roan horse he had taken out and brush him down, and then she waited until he had finished and was washing his hands at the pump before she walked over to him. "The heifer is all right?" she asked. "Seems to be. Just a bit of digestive trouble." "I moved her to the smaller pen to keep an eye on her." "Good," Martha said. Then, without preamble, "I need you to explain something to me." Raymond straightened from the pump and looked at her. Whatever he saw in her expression made him go slightly careful in the way that honest people go careful when they know a thing is about to be uncovered. "I found the ledger open when I went to find your receipt," she said. "I was not prying. My name was on the page and I looked at it. You have been recording $16 per month as my wages. I have received $8. Raymond was very still. "So either there is an error in your ledger," Martha said, keeping her voice measured and even, "or you have been keeping an amount aside that belongs to me. I want to understand which it is and why." Raymond Fairchild looked at her for a long moment, then looked away toward the western sky where the light was turning amber and deep. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who has decided that honesty is the only available option and is not entirely sorry about it. "It is the second one," he said. "I have been setting the other 8 aside in a separate account at the bank in Dusty Creek, in your name." Martha blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not precisely that. "In my name?" "Yes." "Why?" she asked, and her voice was still even, but there was something sharp underneath it now, something that was not quite anger but was very close to it. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He turned the pump handle once more, though he did not need to. "Because $8 a month is not what that work is worth," he said. "That is what I offered initially because I did not know, when you came, what you would be able to do. Within the first week it was clear that you were doing the work of at least 2 men and very likely the work of a foreman." He paused. "The work you have done here in less than 3 months has put this ranch back into working order in ways that I had not managed in 2 years on my own. $8 a month is not fair compensation for that. 16 is closer to fair." "I did not know how to bring it up directly, so I simply set the additional amount aside for you." Martha looked at him for a long moment. The amber light was on the side of his face and he looked tired again, that particular tired she had noticed when she first arrived, but there was something else in his expression now. Something that looked very much like sincerity scraped raw. "You did not know how to bring it up directly," she repeated. "No. So instead you simply didn't tell me." "Yes." "Mr. Fairchild," Martha said, "that money is mine and I was not given the choice of whether to receive it or where to put it. You made that decision for me without asking." "I know," he said, and he did not flinch from it. "I am not a charity," she said, and now there was real edge in her voice. "I know that too," he said, and there was something urgent in his voice now, something that pressed against the composure. "Martha, that is not what this was. I did not put it aside because I thought you needed charity. I put it aside because you had earned it, and I did not know how to look you in the face and tell you. I had underpaid you without admitting that I had offered you less than I would have offered a man with your same skills. And I was ashamed of that." The silence that followed those words was the kind that has weight to it, that settles on the ground and stays there. Martha looked at him carefully. She was good at reading people. She had grown up in a house where reading people quickly had been a practical skill, and years of working alongside strangers had sharpened it further. What she saw in Raymond Fairchild's face in that moment was not condescension or pity or the kind of patronizing benevolence that made her teeth set. What she saw was something much simpler and in some ways much more difficult to deal with, genuine shame and genuine respect fighting each other in the expression of a proud man who had done a thing he knew was wrong and was standing there saying so. "You should have told me from the beginning," she said. Her voice had come down out of the sharp register. "You should have told me what you thought the work was actually worth and paid me that from the start." "Yes," he said, "I should have. And in the future," she said, "if there is anything concerning my wages or my work or my situation here, I expect to be spoken to directly about it." "Yes," he said again, with the same quiet steadiness. "The money in the bank account," she said. "How much is there?" $16, 2 months at the additional 8. "I want access to that account," she said. "In my name, as you say it is. I will speak to the bank in town." "Of course," he said immediately. "I will write a letter to Mr. Hatch at the bank today." Martha held his gaze for another moment, making absolutely certain he understood the full weight of what had passed between them. Then she gave a small, deliberate nod. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She turned and walked back toward the barn to finish the evening feed, and she did not look back. But she was aware, in the particular way that certain women are aware of certain men, that Raymond Fairchild stood watching her go. That night, alone in her small bunkhouse room with the lamp turned low and the dry October wind coming in around the window frame, Martha Rourke sat on the edge of her cot and thought about the expression on Raymond Fairchild's face when he had said the word ashamed. She thought about it for longer than she strictly intended to. Over the days that followed, something shifted between them. It was not uncomfortable, exactly, but it was new. There was a particular transparency in Raymond now, a deliberate openness that had not been there before, as though the conversation at the pump had broken something loose in him that he was not trying to put back. He spoke to her more directly about the ranch's finances, asking her opinion on whether to sell 2 of the steers before winter or carry them through, explaining his thinking when he made decisions about the herd, treating her less like a hired hand and more like a partner in the practical business of the place. Martha found this both satisfying and slightly dangerous. She found it satisfying because it was what she had always wanted from work, to be taken seriously, to have her judgment counted for something. She found it dangerous because she was becoming increasingly aware that she liked Raymond Fairchild's company in a way that went somewhat beyond professional appreciation. She dealt with this the way she dealt with most things. She continued to do her work excellently and kept her interior landscape firmly to herself. In October, 2 things happened that complicated matters considerably. The first was the arrival of a letter for Raymond that came on the Tuesday mail stage. Martha happened to be in the yard when old Eb Farnsworth from the postal route dropped it off, and she saw the way Raymond's face changed when he read it. He folded it quickly and put it in his shirt pocket, and he was quiet for the rest of that day in a way that was different from his usual quiet, more like something pressing on him from the inside. She did not ask about it. It was not her business. But the following morning he came to find her in the tack room and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it in that circular way that men do when they are working up to something. "My wife's brother," he said, without preamble. "He has written to say he intends to contest the ownership of this land. He claims Clara was promised a portion of it before we married, and that her portion should have reverted to her family when she died." Martha set down the bridle she was cleaning. "Is there any legal basis for that claim?" "He thinks there is. I think there is not. But the territorial court will need to weigh in, and that means I need to go to Guthrie and speak with a land attorney before the end of the month." "How long would you be gone?" "At least a week, possibly 2. He was looking at her steadily. "I would need someone here to manage things." "I will manage things," Martha said simply, because it was a simple thing to say. The ranch was running well now, and she knew every inch of it. She could manage 2 weeks without difficulty. Something crossed Raymond's face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere between the two. "I would pay you additionally for the extra responsibility," he said, and there was a slight deliberateness to it, a care, as though he wanted to make sure there was no question this time about what was owed and what she would receive. Martha looked at him for a moment. "I know you would," she said, and the words came out quieter than she had intended, with something in them that surprised even her. Raymond left 3 days later on the morning stage to Guthrie, and Martha stood on the porch watching the dust of the road settle after the wagon had passed the bend, and she was aware of something in herself that she did not especially want to examine. She ran the ranch. She ran it efficiently and competently, as she did everything. She kept careful notes on the herd, and the weather and the state of the feed supplies. She hired a young man from town named Pete Calloway for 3 days of the second week, when a section of the north fence came down in a wind storm, and she needed extra hands. She paid him out of the household emergency fund that Raymond had shown her the location of, and she documented every cent. She wrote it all down in a letter that she intended to give Raymond when he returned, a full accounting of the 2 weeks, because she thought he would want to know, and because she thought clarity about such things was always better than assumption. But on the 9th day, in the evening, she was sitting on the porch after the work was done with a cup of coffee that was actually still warm for once, watching the light go down over the western pasture, and she found herself thinking about what Raymond had said about his wife Clara, about sitting with someone who was sick for a year and watching them go, about the ranch falling apart in the margins of that grief and the long work of trying to pull it back together. She thought about her own husband Daniel, who had been a decent man and who she had been fond of, but who she had not loved in the way that the word love was supposed to mean. She had been 22 when she married him, and she had been practical about it, the way that women sometimes had to be practical, and she had grieved him genuinely when he died, but it had been the grief of losing companionship and security, not the grief of losing a piece of yourself. She wondered if Raymond had loved Clara in the way that left that kind of hole in a person. She suspected he had. She sat on the porch until the stars came out, which was longer than she usually permitted herself to simply sit, and she went to bed thinking thoughts that were not entirely professional in nature. Raymond returned on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after he had left. Martha was in the south pasture checking on the heifer who had continued to improve when she heard the wagon coming up the drive, and she arrived at the barn in time to see him climbing down from the seat with the expression of a man who has fought a hard thing and come out the right side of it, though not without cost. "The court sided with you?" Martha asked. "They did," he said. "It took most of the 2 weeks and several conversations I would rather not have had, but yes." He looked at her. "How is everything here?" "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee on and I have a written report for you." Raymond stopped in the act of unhitching the horse and looked at her. "A written report," he repeated, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not quite been there before he left, or perhaps she simply heard it differently now. "Of course you do." They sat at the kitchen table and she went through everything, page by page, including the fence damage and Pete Calloway's 3 days of work, and the exact amount she had spent from the emergency fund and what she had done with the herd, and the state of every section of the property. Raymond listened to all of it and asked several good questions, and when she was done, he sat back in his chair looking at her with that expression that she had come to recognize as his version of impressed, which was quiet and slightly overwhelmed. "Martha," he said. "Yes. I do not know what I would have done without you here." She meant to say something practical and deflecting, the kind of thing she usually said when people complimented her work. Instead, she found herself simply looking at him across the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, with the coffee steam between them and the ticking of the clock on the mantel, and she said, "I think you would have managed." "Not as well," he said, and then, as though the words surprised him as much as they surprised her, "not nearly as well, and not only with the ranch." The kitchen was very quiet. "Raymond," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and both of them noticed it. He looked at her with those whiskey-colored eyes and did not look away. "I know," he said, though she had not said anything. "I know this is a complicated situation, and I know that I am your employer, and that puts you in a position where you are not making me uncomfortable," she said. He stopped. "I want to be clear about that," she said, "because I think you are about to apologize for something that does not require an apology." She held his gaze steadily, because she was Martha Rourke and she had never looked away from anything in her life. "But I think we should both be honest about what this is before it becomes something neither of us has properly thought about." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "What do you think it is?" he asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have feelings for you that are not strictly professional. I think that has been true for some weeks. I think I have been pretending otherwise and doing a fairly poor job of it when I am alone." She paused. "And I think you may have some feelings in the same direction. And I think we are both sensible people who understand that feelings are not the same as decisions." Raymond was looking at her as though she had said something in a language he had not been certain anyone else spoke. "You are the most straightforward person I have ever met," he said. "My father used to say I came out of the womb with opinions and never stopped having them," she said. "Is that a complaint or an observation?" "It is the furthest thing from a complaint," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was warm in a way that moved all the way through her. "Martha, I have been thinking about you in a manner that has been somewhat distracting for the better part of 2 months. I am glad the heifer recovered while I was gone, and I am glad the fence is fixed. And the first thing I thought when the wagon turned off the main road toward the ranch was that you would be here." Martha Rourke was not a woman who blushed easily. She was aware, sitting at that kitchen table, that she was blushing. "That is a significant thing to tell a person," she said, because she needed a moment to collect herself. "I am aware," he said. "I thought we were being direct with each other." She laughed. She had not laughed in front of him much before this, and the sound of it seemed to startle both of them slightly. "We are," she said. "All right, what do you propose we do about it?" "I think," Raymond said slowly, "that I would very much like to take you to dinner in town on Saturday evening, as a beginning." "As a beginning," she repeated, trying the weight of the words. "That seems like a reasonable thing." "Yes," he said. And he smiled at her then, a real smile, not the almost smile she had seen in the early weeks, and it changed his entire face in a way that was not strictly fair to a woman trying to maintain her composure. They went to dinner at Millie Stanton's restaurant in Dusty Creek on Saturday evening, and Millie Stanton, who knew absolutely everything about everyone within 20 miles and had strong opinions about all of it, brought them a very good roast chicken and a look of deep satisfaction that she made no effort whatsoever to conceal. It was a good evening. It was a very good evening. Raymond wore a clean shirt and a jacket, and had made an effort with his hair that was endearing in its imperfection. And Martha had put on the one dress she owned that was not purely practical, a dark green wool that had been her mother's, and that fit her exactly right. And she had put her hair up with the ivory pins that had survived every move she had made across 2 states and a territory. They talked through 3 cups of coffee each after the plates were cleared, and they talked the way that people talk when they have each been somewhat lonely for a long time and have found someone who makes the sentences come easily. Raymond told her about growing up in Kentucky, the second son of a horse farmer, and how he had come west at 24 with money borrowed from his older brother and bought the land on a combination of determination and inexperience and sheer stubbornness. He told her about Clara, carefully and with love, and Martha was glad he did because it was part of who he was, and she did not want any of him left out. She told him about her own parents, her father who had taught her to ride and her mother who had taught her to think for herself, and about the Missouri farm and Daniel Rourke and the years of working her way west. She told him about the particular kind of freedom that came from knowing you could survive on your own, and how it was the one good thing that had come out of all the hard years. "You are not afraid of very much," he said, not as flattery but as a genuine observation. "I am afraid of a number of things," she said. "I have simply decided that most of them are not reasons to stop moving." He looked at her across the table. "What are you afraid of?" He asked, and it was the kind of question that could have been intrusive and was not, because he asked it the same way he listened, which was with full attention and no performance. Martha thought about it. "Being invisible," she said. "Being in a situation where no one takes seriously what I say or what I can do. Having my choices made for me." A pause. "And horses with bad manners. I have a lower tolerance for that than most people think." Raymond laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, and it was a wonderful sound, a whole-body thing that had clearly been suppressed for too long. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon under a sky absolutely teeming with stars, the kind of sky that only exists in places where there is no other light for miles. And the night air was cold and sharp and smelled of dry grass, and the faint wood smoke of distant homestead fires. Martha had a lap blanket over her knees, and Raymond was driving the team with the ease of long familiarity, and they talked still, or sat quietly when the talking fell away naturally, and both things felt equally right. At the porch steps, Raymond climbed down and offered her his hand to descend, which she did not strictly need but accepted. And when her feet were on the ground, he did not immediately release her hand, and she did not pull it back. "Martha," he said, in the tone of a man who has decided to be brave about something. "Yes, Raymond," she said, in the tone of a woman who is not going to make it harder for him than it needs to be. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would be willing to consider." The stars were very bright above the porch, and the horses were shifting quietly in the traces, and somewhere far out in the dark a coyote called and was answered. "I would be willing to consider it," Martha Rourke said. Courting, as it turned out, was something Raymond Fairchild took seriously in the particular way that he took everything seriously, which was to say with quiet deliberateness and without a great deal of flourish. He brought her small things that had clearly been chosen with thought. A small book of poems he had noticed her looking at in the general store when they went for supplies, a pair of good leather-work gloves to replace hers that were splitting at the seams. He made sure that, when they worked together in the evenings, he found opportunities to talk with her about things beyond the ranch, about the territory and the news that came in on the weekly paper, about the question of whether Oklahoma would achieve statehood in their lifetime, about the small philosophical questions of daily existence that most people did not bother discussing with women at all. Martha received all of this with a warm steadiness that was her way of being pleased without making a production of it. There was, of course, the question of what Dusty Creek thought about the whole situation, because Dusty Creek, being a town of perhaps 300 souls all deeply invested in each other's business, thought quite a lot about it and said most of it out loud. Millie Stanton was firmly in favor. Old Doc Partridge, who was about 70 and had been in the territory since before the war, told Raymond at the barber shop that he was a fortunate man and had better know it. A few of the men around town had opinions about the propriety of a man courting his hired hand, which they expressed with varying degrees of tact, and which Raymond addressed by looking at them in a way that made further commentary feel unwelcome. One woman, Mrs. Genevieve Prout, who considered herself the social arbiter of Dusty Creek, despite the fact that she was not particularly liked, told Martha in the dry goods store that she hoped Martha was aware of the awkwardness of her position and the questions it might raise about her character. Martha looked at Mrs. Prout pleasantly and said, "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Prout," in a tone that communicated very clearly that the concern was neither needed nor wanted, and continued selecting her calico, and Mrs. Prout found she did not have anything further to add. November came in cold and clear, and the ranch settled into the different rhythm of winter preparation. There were extra horses to bed down and more thorough feeding schedules, and the matter of the wood supply, which Martha had assessed in October and found to be somewhat short of what a proper winter would require. She had arranged with a man named Lars Pedersen, who had a timber claim 10 miles north of town, to deliver 2 wagon loads of cut wood, and she had done this on her own initiative and told Raymond about it afterward, and he had simply nodded and said, "Good thinking." And she had felt the same warm solidity in her chest that she always felt when he said things like that, not because she needed his approval, but because his approval was genuine when it came, and that made it worth having. On a Sunday in early November, in the afternoon when the work was done, and the early dark was coming in soft and gray, Raymond found Martha in the barn giving Duchess her evening grain, and he stood in the barn doorway for a moment just looking at her, and she became aware of him in the way she was always aware of him, some peripheral warmth in her attention that had nothing to do with sight. "I want to tell you something," he said. She straightened from the grain bucket and waited. "When I put that advertisement in the general store," he said, coming slowly into the barn, "I expected someone like Cord Whitley to show up, or Pete Calloway. I was prepared for a young man who would need some direction and who might or might not stick around. I was not prepared for." He stopped, turned his hat in his hands once, and then seemed to decide against the complicated version. "I was not prepared for you." "What were you not prepared for specifically?" she asked, because she wanted to know exactly what he meant. He looked at her, and the barn was warm around them with the smell of hay and animals and the amber lamp light. "For someone who made this place feel like it was alive again," he said. "I had been going through the motions of running a ranch for 2 years, and that is what it was, motions. And then you arrived, and within a week everything had a point to it again. Not just because the work was getting done, but because—" He stopped again, and she could see him working through the words carefully, not performing but genuinely trying to say the thing correctly. "Because you are here," he said finally, simply. "That is what I was not prepared for." Martha looked at him in the lamplight for a moment. This quiet, tired, genuine man who turned his hat in his hands when he was trying to say something real. And something in her made a decision that her more cautious self had been postponing for weeks. She crossed the barn floor and kissed him, because she was Martha Rourke and she had never waited for things when they were clearly the right thing to do. Raymond Fairchild, to his very great credit, did not seem surprised for more than a fraction of a second. His hands settled on her shoulders and then around her, and the kiss was warm and careful, and the kind that makes the world seem briefly very simple. When they broke apart, the horses were entirely unimpressed and continued eating, and Martha could feel his heartbeat under her hands where she had placed them on his chest, faster than his usual steadiness, and she thought it was probably the first honest victory she had ever won that had nothing to do with labor. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and his voice was somewhat rougher than usual. "I think this is a fairly clear indication of where things stand," she said. "I think you are right," he said. "Martha, he took a breath. "I am in love with you." I believe I have been since approximately the third week you were here, when you reorganized the tack room without being asked, and told me it needed doing as though it were the most obvious thing in the world." She laughed again, that surprised laugh that she had only recently started giving freely. "That is a very specific thing to fall in love over. You are a very specific person," he said, and he was smiling at her, that whole-face smile that she thought she could look at for a very long time. "I mean it, Martha. Not just the work, not just the competence, though God knows that is extraordinary. The way you say exactly what you mean and do not apologize for it. The way you care for the animals. The way you argued with me at the pump about the wages because you were right and you knew it and you were not going to let it go." He paused. "I am deeply in love with you." Martha stood in the barn with her hands still on his chest and looked at him steadily. "I love you as well," she said. "I have been attempting not to for some time, and I have been entirely unsuccessful." Raymond laughed and pulled her back in and held her, and the lamplight moved around them, and outside the wind was picking up, and it was cold, and it was November in Oklahoma territory, and everything was exactly as good as it was. The following weeks had a different quality to them. Not different in the daily work, which continued as it always had, the feeding and the fence checks and the supply runs, but different in the texture of the days, the way that color changes when a light source shifts. Raymond and Martha moved through the ranch with the same practicality they had always brought to it, but now when their hands met over a fence rail or a halter buckle it was not incidental, and when they sat together in the evenings by the fire in the main house, which had become natural by this point, there was a warmth between them that had nothing to do with the stove. Raymond showed her his mother's china, still packed in a crate in the back bedroom. He showed her the deed to the property, the one he had defended in Guthrie, and she read it carefully, and he did not hurry her. He showed her Clara's grave behind the old elm tree at the north edge of the house yard, a quiet and private thing, and she stood with him there for a moment, and understood without anything needing to be said that love is not a finite quantity that gets used up, and that morning, one person and loving another can exist without conflict in a big enough heart. She showed him the few things she carried from her former life, the ivory hair pins that had been her mother's, the small daguerreotype of her parents taken the year before her father died, the journal she had been keeping since she was 16 that was filled with her observations about soil and weather and livestock, and occasionally, in the margins, small notes about beauty that she had never shown to anyone. Raymond read 2 pages of it with her permission, and when he looked up his expression was very tender. "You have been paying attention to the world your whole life," he said. "Someone has to," she said. He proposed to her on a December morning, which was not the setting that most women would have planned for a proposal. They had been out to check the horses in the paddock and it had started to snow, the first real snow of that winter, coming down in large slow flakes that muffled everything and made the world look clean, and Raymond had looked at her standing in the snow with snowflakes in her auburn hair and her hat slightly crooked and her breath misting the cold air, and he had simply stopped walking and said her name. She turned to look at him. "Martha Rourke," he said, "I want you to be my wife. I want us to run this ranch together, and I want it to be together in every sense of the word and not just the professional one. I want you to have the same claim to this land that I have, and I want to sit with you on that porch until we are very old and extremely opinionated, and I want every morning to start with you here." He paused. "I do not have a ring with me at this particular moment, because I had not planned to say this in a snowstorm in the paddock, but I want you to know that the sentiment is entirely genuine regardless of the setting." Martha looked at him in the falling snow for a moment. She was aware of something in her chest that was larger and warmer than anything she had felt in years, possibly ever, something that was not practical or cautious or measured, but was simply enormous and true. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Raymond Fairchild." He crossed the space between them and kissed her with snow falling on both of them, and the horses watched with the philosophical patience that horses generally apply to human behavior. "I also," Martha said, against his shoulder, Want it documented in advance that I will continue to have full management responsibility for the horses and the east pasture fencing, because you have a tendency to use 3 nails where 5 would be better." "Completely agreed," he said, and she could feel him laughing. They married in February of 1883, in the parlor of the main house with Millie Stanton and Doc Partridge and Reverend Haskell from the Dusty Creek Church and Pete Calloway, who had become something of a regular presence at the ranch since the fence work in October. Martha wore her mother's green dress, which was the finest thing she owned and which fit her as though it had been made for the occasion. Raymond wore his good jacket and the boots he had clearly spent considerable time polishing. The Reverend performed the ceremony with a warmth and simplicity that Martha appreciated, and when he asked Raymond if he took this woman, Raymond looked at Martha and said, "I do," with the quiet certainty of a man who has thought carefully about the words and means every syllable of them. Martha said her own vows, looking Raymond directly in the eyes, as she did everything, clearly and without hesitation. She had added one line to the standard vows that she had told Reverend Haskell she intended to include. "I will speak plainly to you always, and I ask the same of you, because I believe that honesty between people is the foundation on which everything else can be built." Reverend Haskell had blinked at it and then nodded, because it was, after all, a more solid foundation than many he had witnessed in 20 years of performing ceremonies. Millie Stanton cried, which she had strongly implied she would not. After the ceremony, there was a supper that Millie had provided, and a bottle of very good whiskey that Doc Partridge had produced from somewhere with the air of a man who had been saving it for an occasion. And Pete Calloway ate his weight in biscuits and left before dark to get back to his own boarding house situation in town. And Reverend Haskell departed with the blessing of a man who has seen a good thing happen. That night in the main house that was now equally Martha's, with the winter wind moving around the eaves and the fire burning in the bedroom grate, Raymond held her in the dark and said, "I want you to know that everything that is mine is yours, not as a gift, as a right. You have earned a partnership in this land, and I want it to be real in every way the law allows." "I know," she said. "I intend to hold you to it." "I know you do," he said, with a warmth in his voice that was the warmest thing she had ever heard. The spring of 1883 brought a renewal of the ranch that felt, to both of them, like a reflection of what was happening inside the house. The east pasture, which Martha had restored the previous summer, was verdant and well-maintained. Raymond had acquired 2 additional horses in a trade with a man from the neighboring county, both solid working animals with good temperaments that Martha assessed with her usual thoroughness and approved of. The kitchen garden, which she had let go largely wild the previous year because there had been too much else to do, was planted properly now with tomatoes and squash and beans, and the herbs that Martha had been accumulating from the general store. One afternoon in April, Raymond came home from a trip to Dusty Creek with the mail and the weekly supplies and something additional, a piece of paper from the county land office that he set on the kitchen table and smoothed with his hand. Martha looked at it. It was an amended deed, recently filed with the Territorial Land Records Office. It listed the property as belonging to Raymond Fairchild and Martha Fairchild, formerly Rourke, jointly and in equal measure. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Raymond. "I meant what I said on our wedding night," he said. "I wanted it to be real in every way the law allows." Martha looked back at the deed. Her name, printed there in the careful official lettering of a territorial land record, her name on a piece of land on a real and solid place in the world. She had not cried when her family's farm in Missouri had been taken. She had not cried when Daniel died. She had not cried at any point in 3 years of hard westward travel. She had not cried when she had arrived at the Fairchild Ranch with a carpetbag and a determination so fierce it could bend iron. She cried now, briefly and fiercely, the way that people cry when something they did not know they had been holding on to finally lets go. Raymond put his arms around her and did not say anything, because he had the wisdom to know that nothing needed to be said. That summer was the best one she could remember. They worked together on the ranch with the deepened efficiency of two people who know each other well and trust each other completely. Martha took on additional responsibility for the business side of the operation because she had a better head for figures than Raymond cheerfully acknowledged, and she began keeping the ranch accounts with a thoroughness that made the ledger, which had once held that doubled wage entry that had started everything, into something considerably more orderly. Raymond expanded the herd. They hired Pete Calloway as a permanent hand, giving him fair wages and the bunkhouse room that had been Martha's, and Pete was grateful and hardworking, and had the good sense to stay out of the way of a woman who clearly ran her portion of the operation with the authority of someone who would tolerate exactly no nonsense. There were also, by that summer, conversations about the future that had a particular warmth to them, the kind that are about more than fences and cattle. Raymond was 34 and Martha was 27, and they were both very aware that they were not young in the way that youth is carelessly young, but that they were young enough for things to still be possible. In September of 1883, Martha confirmed what she had begun to suspect in August, and she told Raymond on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen over a supper she had not eaten much of because her appetite had been unreliable lately. Raymond went very still in the way that men go still when something enormous is happening, and they need a moment to receive it properly. Then he set down his fork and looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face, stripped of all the careful reserve, purely and completely astounded and full. "Martha," he said. "In the spring, I think," she said. "I spoke with Doc Partridge yesterday." Raymond came around the table in a movement that was neither graceful nor planned and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and said something into her hair that was not quite a coherent sentence but conveyed its meaning perfectly well. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling somewhat unreliable where food is concerned," she said, "but otherwise I am perfectly fine. I am not fragile, Raymond." "I know you are not fragile," he said. "You are the least fragile person I have ever encountered. I am asking because I care about you, not because I think you are made of glass." She smiled at him, the smile that she saved for moments when he said exactly the right thing, which was fairly often. "I know," she said. "I am all right. We are all right." They were. That autumn and winter were busy in a different way than the previous ones, with the particular busyness of a household preparing for a new person. Raymond built an additional room off the east side of the house, with the focus of a man who needed to do something constructive with the enormous amount of feeling he was carrying around. And Martha told him what dimensions made sense, and which way the window should face, and he listened to all of it, and built exactly what she described, because he had long since understood that her instincts were better than most people's deliberate plans. The baby arrived in early March of 1884, at dawn on a Thursday, delivered with Doc Partridge's experienced assistance into a world that was just beginning to turn gold at the edges with the coming spring light. A boy. Healthy and substantial, and, as Raymond said with the utter tactlessness of a man overwhelmed by feeling, the loudest thing he had ever heard. They named him Thomas John Fairchild. Thomas for Raymond's older brother in Kentucky who had lent him the money to come west all those years ago, and John for Martha's father, who had taught her to ride and to have opinions and to look the world directly in the face. Martha held him in the bedroom, with the morning light coming through the window she had specified, and looked at this small and entirely new person with the same clear-eyed attention she brought to everything. He had Raymond's dark hair already and Martha's stubborn set to his mouth, which Doc Partridge said with some amusement suggested he was going to be quite a handful. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them with an expression so open and undefended that Martha thought it was perhaps the best thing she had ever seen. "We built something," he said quietly. "We did," she agreed. "More than one thing," he said, meaning the ranch and the partnership and Thomas John, and all the invisible things that exist between two people who have chosen each other fully. More than one thing, she confirmed. Thomas grew in the way that healthy babies grow, steadily and loudly, and with great enthusiasm for all the parts of the ranch that were not yet age-appropriate for him, which he communicated through persistent attempts to explore them the moment anyone looked away. By the time he was walking, Pete Calloway had appointed himself an unofficial shadow in the barn and the yard, and Martha observed this with gratitude and the quiet knowledge that this was what community meant in the most genuine sense. The years moved through the ranch like weather, each one bringing something new. In 1885, there was a dry summer that tested the water supply and required the digging of a second well, a project that Raymond and Pete undertook, while Martha managed the reduced herd rotation with the meticulous care of someone who had been studying drought patterns in the region for 2 years and had prepared for it. They lost fewer animals than any of the surrounding ranches. Raymond told anyone who asked that this was because his wife understood the land better than he did. He said this matter-of-factly and without any false modesty, because it was true. In 1886, a family named Vasquez arrived from the south, displaced from their own land by a territorial dispute that Martha found, when she heard the details, to be exactly the kind of injustice that made her chest tighten with a cold anger. Elena Vasquez and her husband Miguel had worked good land for 11 years and had been pushed off it through legal maneuvering by a larger ranching operation with better connections to the territorial administration. They arrived at the edge of the Fairchild property one November evening with 3 children, and a wagon of their belongings, and Raymond brought them in without hesitation, because Raymond Fairchild had never in his life been the kind of man who drove people away from shelter. Martha had a practical conversation with Elena that first evening while the children were settled and the men were in the barn, and she found in Elena Vasquez a person of the same practical, unsentimental competence that she recognized from her own mirror. Elena was a magnificent cook, which Martha was not particularly, and had made her peace with, and she understood horses and livestock and gardening with the expertise of a woman who had grown her own food since childhood. Raymond and Miguel Vasquez worked out an arrangement over the following weeks: fair wages, and the use of the small house that Raymond built with Pete Calloway's help in a corner of the east property line. And the Vasquez family became part of the fabric of the Fairchild operation in the way that good arrangements do when they benefit everyone genuinely. This was, Martha noted in her accounts, also simply better business, because with Miguel's additional help the ranch could run more of the south pasture efficiently, and the cattle numbers could increase. She documented this with figures in the ledger that Raymond sometimes read in the evenings, with the expression of a man who is deeply grateful that one of them is good with numbers. Thomas Fairchild, who was 2 years old when the Vasquezes arrived, and who therefore grew up with their children as his primary companions, learned to speak with occasional Spanish phrases mixed in with his English, which delighted Elena and amused Raymond, and which Martha thought was probably the most useful thing that could happen to any child growing up in Oklahoma Territory in the 1880s. In the summer of 1887, Martha discovered she was expecting again. She was 31 years old, and she told Raymond with the same directness she had brought to all important conversations between them, at the kitchen table after supper, and Raymond's response was the same whole-body joy it had been the first time, slightly less shocked but no less warm. This time a girl, born in February of 1888 on a day that was bitter cold outside but very warm inside the house, with Elena Vasquez present alongside Doc Partridge, because Elena had 3 children's worth of experience, and Martha had wanted another woman in the room. They named her Clara Rose Fairchild. Clara for the woman Raymond had loved and lost, because Martha had suggested it herself, quietly and deliberately, because she believed that the dead should be honored and that love was large enough to carry everyone, and because she wanted her daughter to carry the name as something good. Rose for Martha's mother, whose name she had been. Raymond, when she told him the name she wanted, had held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment and said, "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known." "I know," she said simply, and kissed him. Clara Rose turned out to have auburn hair like her mother and her grandfather John before her, and the same whiskey-colored eyes as her father, and the combined stubbornness of both parents concentrated in a small person who was going to be enormously interesting to raise. Martha looked at her with great recognition and great love, and the calm confidence of a woman who understood exactly what this particular kind of person would need from the world. The ranch had reached, by the end of the 1880s, a state of genuine prosperity. Not extravagant prosperity, not the kind that came with a great house and a staff, but the solid, real prosperity of a working operation that was managed well and built on honest labor. The herd was healthy and consistently profitable. The land was maintained with the long-term thinking that Martha had brought to it from the beginning, the kind of thinking that looks at soil and water and weather as things to work with rather than against. Pete Calloway, who was 26 by now and had grown into a genuinely good ranch hand with better judgment than he had arrived with, had begun courting a young woman from Dusty Creek named Annabel Foster, and Raymond had given him permission to build a room onto the bunkhouse proper for a home if things progressed in that direction, which Martha thought was the decent thing to do and said so. Things did progress, and Pete married Annabel in the spring of 1889 in the same understated fashion that suited him, and the Fairchild Ranch had expanded into something that felt, increasingly, less like a ranch and more like a small community of people who had chosen each other and the land they worked together. Oklahoma Territory achieved statehood moves in 1890, and with it came changes to land recording and a new set of administrative requirements that Martha found largely irritating in their inefficiency, but managed with the focused competence she brought to all bureaucratic encounters. The Fairchild Ranch's joint deed was re-registered under the new territorial statutes without difficulty, because Raymond had been meticulous about the paperwork since 1883, and Martha had been more meticulous still. Thomas Fairchild was 6 years old by 1890, and already deeply obsessed with horses in the way that certain children become obsessed with the thing they will eventually be very good at. He followed Martha around the barn with the concentrated attention of a student who knows they are in the presence of a master, and Martha taught him with the same patience she gave to every animal she had ever worked with, which was considerable. "Watch her ears," she told him one morning, both of them standing at the fence while Duchess, old now and gentle, ate her morning grain. "Always watch the ears first. They will tell you more than anything else about what she is thinking." Thomas watched with intense 6-year-old concentration. "They are flat," he reported. "Good observation. Why do you think that might be?" "Because she is eating and she is not worried about anything." "Exactly right," Martha said, and Thomas looked so pleased with himself that she had to suppress a smile. Raymond, watching from the barn doorway with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, thought that if he had to choose one moment from everything that had happened since a red-haired woman had ridden up his drive in the late spring of 1882 with cracked gloves and a carpetbag, this might be the one he would keep. Though he had said variations of this to himself many times before, because there had been many such moments, and he suspected there would be many more, and the keeping of all of them was the work of a happy life. The summer of 1890 brought a visitor who complicated things briefly and resolved them well. Raymond's older brother James came from Kentucky in July, his first visit since Raymond had left nearly 2 decades before. James Fairchild was 51, a broad man with the same dark eyes as Raymond, but with a more formal bearing that came from having stayed in a more settled place. He arrived on the stage from Guthrie, and Raymond met him at the Dusty Creek station with a handshake that held something more than a handshake, the particular weight of brothers who have been far from each other for a long time. Martha met James Fairchild that evening at supper, with Thomas and Clara Rose at the table and Alina's excellent cooking serving as a diplomatic backdrop, and she read him carefully in the way she read everyone. What she found was a man who was curious about her, which was fair, and who had opinions, which was also fair, but who was fundamentally decent, and who loved his brother in the uncomplicated way of family ties that have weathered time and distance. James looked around the table and around the ranch and listened to Raymond, and Martha talked through the supply situation for the following quarter, and watched how they moved around each other in the kitchen and the yard, the ease of it, the mutual navigation of people who know each other's habits deeply. And on the second evening he took Raymond aside while Martha was putting the children to bed. Martha, returning through the kitchen door, heard the last portion of the conversation through the screen. "You found yourself a good one, Raymond," James was saying. "I know it," Raymond replied. "I mean, she runs this place half herself and she does not appear to resent you for it," James said, which was a slightly more complicated thing to say and less entirely correct than he thought, but Martha let it pass. "She does not resent it because she has full authority over it," Raymond said. "Her name is on the deed the same as mine. I'm not managing her here, James. We manage it together." A pause. "That is not very conventional," James said. "No," Raymond agreed. "It is very Martha." Martha went upstairs to finish putting the children to bed, with something very warm moving through her chest. James Fairchild stayed 3 weeks and left with a genuine affection for both of them, and a standing invitation to return that Martha extended herself, because she found that she liked him well enough once he had settled into the reality of the place. He had given Raymond the borrowed money that had bought this land in the first place, and she thought that deserved gratitude that was expressed rather than merely felt. The decade moved on. Thomas became 7, then 8, then 10, and grew into a boy who was quiet like his father and practical like his mother, and absolutely devoted to anything with 4 legs and a mane. Clara Rose grew into a small person of opinions and persistence, who very early demonstrated her mother's directness and her father's tendency toward careful observation, combined into a combination that was entirely her own. In 1892, a drought came that was more severe than the one in 1885, and the territory suffered broadly. The Fairchild Ranch had prepared for it, because Martha had spent the intervening years making sure they prepared for it. The second well and the water storage and the fodder reserves and the strategic reduction of herd numbers the previous autumn that she had recommended based on the winter's rainfall patterns. They were not untouched by the difficulty, but they were not broken by it, and that was the difference that planning made. A neighboring ranch, the Holloway property to the south, was less fortunate. Old Jim Holloway had been ranching alone since his wife died in the late 1880s, and his land management had grown less systematic with age and circumstance, and the drought hit him badly. Raymond rode out to his property in August and came back quiet and thoughtful. "He is going to lose it if next year is no better," Raymond said. Martha looked at him. "What does he need?" "Feed, mostly, and his water storage is inadequate." "Can we spare the feed?" she asked. "If we are careful, yes." "Then we should spare it," Martha said, "and tell him we will send Pete over to look at his water storage situation and give him an opinion on what can be improved before the next dry season." Raymond looked at her for a moment. "You always know what the right thing is before I finish the thought." "You would have said exactly the same thing," she said. "Eventually," he agreed. Jim Holloway's ranch survived the drought, with the Fairchild's assistance and with Holloway's own stubborn determination. And he came to the Fairchild place in November of 1892 with his hat in his hands and a look of a man who is finding gratitude a difficult thing to articulate. "I want you to know," he said, standing on the porch, "that what you did for me was—" He stopped and tried again. "I know how things go out here. I have watched neighbors let neighbors go under because it is a hard land and everyone has their own difficulties. You did not do that. You would have done the same for us," Raymond said. Jim Holloway looked at him and then at Martha and said, "I would have tried," which was both honest and gracious, and Martha thought well of him for not pretending to be more generous than he actually knew himself to be. By the mid-1890s, the Fairchild Ranch had grown into one of the more stable and respected operations in that part of the territory. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, but the kind of place that people spoke about as an example of what sensible management and genuine partnership could build. Martha's reputation in the county had evolved over the years from the object of some speculation and mild disapproval to something more like quiet authority. She had proven the doubters wrong in the most effective possible way, which was simply by continuing to be excellent at what she did, year after year, until there was nothing left to doubt. Mrs. Prout from the dry goods store had, by 1894, reconsidered several of her opinions, though she did not announce this loudly. She did, however, begin asking Martha's advice on her own kitchen garden, which Martha gave freely because she had never wasted energy on grudges. Thomas Fairchild turned 12 in 1896 and was already more than half a man in his ability with horses, with his mother's instincts and his father's patience. He was in the barn one October morning teaching his 8-year-old sister Clara Rose the same ear-watching lesson Martha had given him 6 years before, in almost the same words, and Martha overheard it from outside the barn wall and stood very still with her hand on the warm, weathered wood, and felt something complete and full in a way that is difficult to describe. She went in around the corner after a moment and found both children watching Duchess with the focused attention of apprentice naturalists. "Her ears are relaxed," Clara Rose announced without looking up. "She is not worried about anything." "Good," Martha said. Thomas looked over his shoulder at his mother with an expression so like Raymond's that it always made her catch for a moment. "I told her what you told me," he said. "I know," Martha said. "You told her well." That evening, after supper and after the children were in bed and the dishes were done, and the accounts for the week were written up, and the lamp in the office was burning low, Martha and Raymond sat on the wide porch in the autumn cool with blankets over their knees, which was a concession to the years that Martha had made with less resistance than she might have expected of herself. The sky over the Oklahoma land was enormous and brilliant, the stars coming out in their thousands over the dark shape of the pastures and the tree line. "Do you remember," Raymond said, "the advertisement I put up in the general store?" "I have a reasonably clear memory of it, yes," Martha said dryly. "I wrote it 3 times before I was satisfied with it," he said. "I threw away the first 2 because they sounded too desperate. I was trying to strike the right tone." Martha looked at him. "You were worried about the tone of a job advertisement posted in a town of 300 people. I wanted to get it right," he said, and there was a smile in his voice. She shook her head, but she was smiling too. "And then I turned up instead of the Cord Whitley you were expecting." "And then you turned up," he confirmed, "in your father's hat with the cracked gloves." "I still have those gloves," she said. "They are not fit for work anymore, but I kept them." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you read that advertisement," he said. "I am glad it was pinned where you walked past it and not 2 streets over." "I am glad of the same thing," she said. The night was very quiet around them, the particular quiet of a working land at rest, the distant sound of the horses settling in the barn and the small noises of the October night, and the warmth of Raymond's shoulder against hers beneath the shared blanket. "I want to tell you something," Raymond said, which was what he always said when he was about to say something real. "I know," she said, which was what she always said. "I think sometimes about what this ranch would be without you," he said. "Not what it would look like or how it would run. I know the answer to that, which is poorly, but what it would feel like. And I think it would feel like going through the motions again, the way it felt before you came." He paused. "And I am grateful every single day that I do not have to know what that is like anymore." Martha looked at the stars for a moment. Then she looked at him, this man she had come to know in every way that a person can be known, the tired man with the good eyes who had turned his hat in his hands outside a barn in the spring of 1882 and looked past her for someone else, who had put extra money aside for her in a bank account because he was ashamed, and because he valued her work, and because decency was in him even when good judgment was not, who had built a room for a baby with his own hands and filed a deed with 2 names on it and stood at his wife's grave with her and said her first name out loud in a barn and meant it with everything he had. "I know," she said softly. "I am grateful too, every day." He found her hand under the blanket and held it, and they sat on the porch of the ranch that had both their names on its deed and watched the stars over the Oklahoma land until the cold drove them inside, and even then they were in no hurry about it. In the spring of 1897, when Thomas was 13 and Clara Rose was 9, a letter arrived from Raymond's brother James in Kentucky, announcing that James was considering moving west in the next year or two, as his own children were grown and his wife wanted to try the territory before they were too old to enjoy it. Raymond wrote back immediately with an invitation that Martha cossined with genuine enthusiasm, because the place had room for more people who were worth knowing, and she had found, in the 15 years she had been here, that she had become a woman who thought in the long term about everything, the land and the water and the people and the futures. Thomas Fairchild, watching the spring move across the pastures from the fence rail, where he spent considerable time in contemplative observation, was going to be a horseman. This was so clear that it was no longer even a prediction, simply a fact about the future that had already declared itself. Martha had begun to think about what that meant for the ranch, whether there was a market for quality horse training in the territory, whether the operation could expand in that direction. She was making notes in the margin of the household accounts in her small, precise handwriting, the same margins where she had once made notes about beauty, and now the notes about beauty were still there alongside the practical ones, and she did not see any contradiction in that. Clara Rose Fairchild was going to be something Martha could not yet fully predict, which was the most interesting thing about her. She had her mother's directness and her father's patience and some third quality that was entirely her own, a kind of creative attention to the world that expressed itself currently in elaborate drawings of the ranch horses that she produced at every opportunity. Elena Vasquez's eldest daughter, 14-year-old Rosa, was much the same, and the two of them spent weekend afternoons in the kitchen garden in deep conversation about things that neither of them reported to their parents, which Martha thought was exactly right and appropriate. On a morning in June of 1897, Martha was in the east pasture with Thomas doing a routine fence check, the two of them working with the easy synchronized efficiency of people who have done a thing together many times. The sky was very blue and the grass was very green from a good spring, and the horses were far off in the south corner of the pasture doing horse things. Thomas stopped at a post that needed reinforcement and looked at it critically. "5 nails," he said, "not 3. Martha looked at him. "Who told you that?" "You did," he said. "Years ago, I heard you tell Papa that he uses 3 nails where 5 would be better." Martha was quiet for a moment, holding a smile back with some effort. "That is accurate," she said. "Thomas took 5 nails from the pouch and drove them in clean and even. Then he straightened and looked at her with that look that had been Raymond's face when Raymond was thinking through something he wanted to say carefully. "Mama," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Were you afraid when you first came here, to the ranch?" Martha looked at her son for a moment. He was 13, nearly as tall as she was, with her father's red hair finally showing itself fully in his coloring and Raymond's steady eyes. He was a serious person who asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. "No," she said, "not afraid. I was uncertain. I did not know what I was going to find here or whether it would work out, but I have found that uncertainty and fear are different things. Fear stops you. Uncertainty just means you do not know yet, and not knowing yet is the normal state of most situations. You move forward in it and you find out." Thomas thought about this. "That is good," he said. "Your grandfather taught me that," she said. "Indirectly. He used to say that there is no point in worrying about the weather you have not had yet. You prepare for it and then you see what comes." Thomas nodded with the gravity of someone filing something carefully away. They went on down the fence line together in the summer morning, mother and son, checking each post as they went. That evening, the whole household gathered on the porch as they often did in summer when the heat of the day had passed, Raymond and Martha in their usual chairs, Thomas on the steps with his long legs stretched out, Clara Rose doing her drawings at the small table they had moved out for the purpose, Pete and Annabel Calloway from their house across the yard, Alina and Miguel Vasquez and their children from theirs, all of it easy and warm in the summer dusk. Raymond looked around at all of it with the expression he got sometimes, the one that was not quite belief and was something larger than happiness, the particular feeling of a man who has looked at his life and found it genuinely, solidly good. Martha, who was watching him, saw the expression and understood it completely. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, just briefly, because some things are said without words and some of the best ones are. And Raymond looked at her with the whole weight of 15 years between them and the whole lightness of them too. The stars were beginning to come out over the pasture, the ones they had watched together from this porch more times than either could count, and Clara Rose was drawing by the last of the light, and Thomas was talking to Pete about something to do with the horses in the south field, and the Vasquez children were chasing fireflies in the yard, with the squealing enthusiasm of children who find fireflies as miraculous as they deserve to be found. Martha Rourke Fairchild, whose name was on the deed to this land and in the ledger of its accounts, and in the permanent record of the Territorial Land Office, who had arrived here 14 years before with cracked gloves and a carpetbag, and a determination fierce enough to bend iron, sat on her porch on a summer evening in 1897 in Oklahoma Territory, and thought that she had built something worth building. Not alone. That was the part she had not expected and had not known to want, and that turned out to be the truest part of all. She had built it with a man who had looked past her first and then looked directly at her and never stopped, who had been ashamed of a small wrong and corrected it before she even knew it existed, who had put her name on a deed and kept her counsel and taught their son the value of extra nails and held her hand on cold nights and said exactly what he meant when he meant it. She thought about the morning she had found the ledger entry, her name, those doubled figures, and the conversation at the pump in the amber light, and the dinner at Millie Stanton's, and the snow in the paddock, and all the mornings since, the good ones and the hard ones and the ordinary ones, which were the best ones of all. She thought about what Raymond had said on their wedding night about her having earned a partnership in every sense the law allows, and the deed he had filed without telling her first, which was in its own way an echo of the wage situation, but in the opposite direction, a secret that was an act of love rather than an oversight, and she had cried about it and had never once been sorry. Raymond was still watching the yard and the children and the evening coming in, and then he turned and looked at her with those eyes that still did the same thing they had always done, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," she said simply. "All of it." He was quiet for a moment and then, "The job advertisement." "Among other things," she said. He smiled, that whole-face smile that had changed everything the first time she saw it in the barn with the lamplight moving around them. "I am very glad you read it," he said. "I am very glad I did," she said. The fireflies were out in the yard now among the children's laughter, and the stars were well and fully out over the Oklahoma land, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and the porch held all of them in the warm summer evening, and Martha Rourke Fairchild looked at everything she had made and chosen and earned and loved, and she held it all, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right.